In the vast expanse of space where civilizations rise and fall like waves against cosmic shores, there exists a peculiar truth that most species learn too late. The universe doesn't care about your carefully laid plans, your advanced technology. It only cares about one thing: your ability to adapt when everything goes wrong. While the great galactic empires build monuments to their own magnificence and wage wars over territories that span star systems, there are those who slip through the cracks. The forgotten, the abandoned, the lost souls drifting between worlds with nowhere to call home. Most species would consider these beings as expendable casualties of progress, statistical anomalies in the grand equation of galactic civilization. But humans? Humans have always had a peculiar soft spot for the broken and the abandoned. What happens when a simple human mechanic, armed with nothing but spare parts, stubborn determination, and an inexplicable need to fix things that others have given up on, decides that the galaxies discarded deserve better? What happens when that same mechanic discovers that sometimes the most powerful alliances aren't forged in boardrooms or battlefields, but in the quiet corners of space where hope is learned to survive on scraps and ingenuity? This is the story of Marcus Chen, a man who never meant to start a revolution but couldn't help fixing what was broken. This is the story of how humanity's greatest strength isn't our technology, our weapons, or our strategies. It's our refusal to let anyone fall through the cracks, no matter how alien, how different, or how forgotten they might be. In a galaxy that runs on power and politics, sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is simply care about the ones no one else will help. Sometimes the greatest threat to established order comes not from armies or weapons, but from a small workshop on the edge of nowhere where miracles happen one repair at a time. Marcus Chen wiped grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades, squinting at the alien vessel that had just limped into his salvage yard. The ship looked like someone had taken a perfectly good spacecraft and put it through a blender, then tried to reassemble it using duct tape and wishful thinking. Scorch marks decorated its hull like abstract art, and one of its engines was held in place by what appeared to be metallic vines. "Well, that's new," Marcus muttered, grabbing his scanner in a toolbox that contained more jury-rigged equipment than factory parts. His salvage yard, officially called Chen's Orbital Recovery Services but known to locals simply as Marcus's Place, sat in the Kepler Junction, a neutral zone where the major galactic powers had agreed to leave each other alone. It was the perfect spot for someone who preferred fixing things to getting involved in politics. The ship's airlock hissed open, and Marcus found himself face to face with something that defied every xenobiology textbook he'd ever skimmed. The being stood roughly 7 feet tall, with 4 arms that moved independently and skin that shifted colors like oil on water. Most striking were its eyes, 3 of them arranged in a triangle on what Marcus assumed was its face, each one expressing a different emotion. Currently, those emotions appeared to be exhaustion, desperation, and something that might have been hope. "Greetings, human," the being said, its voice coming from somewhere Marcus couldn't identify. "I am Zephyr of the Wandering Current. My vessel requires repair, but I must inform you that I possess no currency recognized by galactic standard." Marcus set down his toolbox and crossed his arms. In the 5 years since he'd set up shop in the junction, he'd learned that the galaxy was full of species with different concepts of value, honor, and payment. He'd also learned that most of them were surprised when a human didn't immediately try to exploit their desperation. "Let me guess," Marcus said. "You're running from something, your ship's about to fall apart, and everyone else you've asked either wanted to turn you in for a bounty or quoted you a price that would bankrupt a small moon." All 3 of Zephyr's eyes blinked in sequence. "Your assessment is remarkably accurate. How did you—" "Because that's the story of about half the folks who end up here." Marcus picked up his scanner and began walking around the ship. "The other half are just cheapskates looking for discount repairs, but something tells me you're not in that category. This burn pattern here suggests plasma cannon fire, and these impact craters are from pursuing vessels. Military grade by the looks of it." Zephyr's skin shifted to a darker shade. "You are very perceptive, human." "Yes, I am what your species might term a refugee," My people, the shifting tide, were classified as a problematic element by the Hegemony Council 3 cycles ago. Those of us who survived the initial purge have been scattered across the galaxy. Marcus had heard whispers about the Hegemony Council's efficiency protocols, basically their method of dealing with species that didn't fit neatly into their vision of galactic order. It was the kind of thing that made him glad humans had never been important enough to warrant their attention. And let me guess, Marcus continued, running his scanner over a particularly nasty section of hull damage, the other major powers won't take you in because they don't want to upset the hegemony, and the independent worlds don't have the resources to help. You seem to understand galactic politics quite well for someone who operates a salvage yard in neutral territory, Marcus chuckled. I understand people, Zephyr. Politics is just people being stupid on a larger scale. He finished his initial scan and faced the alien. Your ship's got 3 major problems. Hull integrity is shot, your navigation system is fried, and that makeshift engine mount is going to fail in the next 20 hours. The good news is, I can fix all of that. The bad news is, it's going to take me about a week. As I mentioned, I cannot pay. Who said anything about payment? Marcus interrupted. I've got a proposition for you. I fix your ship, give you some upgrades that'll help you stay under the radar, and in exchange, you tell other refugees in your situation that Marcus's place is a safe harbor. Fair enough? Zephyr's 3 eyes widened, and its skin cycled through several colors that Marcus interpreted as surprise. You would do this? For a stranger? For no profit? Profit's overrated, Marcus said, hefting his toolbox. Besides, I've got more salvaged parts than I know what to do with, and it's not like business is booming out here. Most of the legitimate traffic goes through the major trade routes, but why would you help someone like me? Your species and mine have no history, no alliance. By galactic standards, you have no obligation to. Marcus stopped walking and turned to face Zephyr directly. Let me tell you something about humans, friend. We've got this weird habit of helping people who need help regardless of whether it makes sense politically or economically. It's gotten us into trouble more times than I can count, but it's also the reason we're still around. Over the next several days, Marcus worked on Zephyr's ship while learning about the shifting tide and their situation. The species was nomadic by nature, living in small family groups that traveled between stars following migration patterns that had remained unchanged for millennia. They were artists, philosophers, and musicians who had never shown any interest in conquest or territorial expansion. Their crime, as far as Marcus could tell, was simply being different. The hegemony claims we are economically non-contributory, Zephyr explained as Marcus replaced burned-out circuitry in the navigation system. We do not establish colonies, we do not extract resources, we do not participate in their trade networks, therefore we serve no purpose in their vision of galactic efficiency. Sounds like they're missing the point, Marcus said, carefully soldering a connection. Not everything valuable shows up on a balance sheet. You truly believe this? Some of the best things humans ever accomplished came from people who weren't trying to be efficient or profitable. They were just trying to help, or create something beautiful, or explore something new. Marcus tested the connection and nodded with satisfaction. Your people's art, for instance. I've been looking at those patterns carved into your ship's interior. That's not just decoration, is it? Zephyr's skin brightened noticeably. No, indeed. Those patterns tell the story of our current journey, where we have been, what we have learned, who we have encountered. Each family group adds to the pattern as they travel, creating a living record of our people's experiences. See, that's valuable in ways the hegemony probably can't even comprehend. Marcus moved on to the next damaged system. They're so focused on measurable outputs that they're missing the fact that art and culture are what make civilization worth having in the first place. As Marcus worked, other ships began arriving at his salvage yard. Word was apparently spreading through whatever networks refugees to communicate. First came a battered transport carrying a family of crystalline singers, beings made of living mineral who communicated through harmonic vibrations. Their ship had been impounded by hegemony forces for unauthorized frequency emissions, and they'd escaped with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a vessel held together by hope and momentum. Next arrived a sleek but heavily damaged craft piloted by someone called Koreth, who belonged to a species Marcus had never encountered before. Korath looked essentially human except for silver skin and eyes that reflected light like mirrors. He claimed to be from a world that had been administratively dissolved by the hegemony for the crime of refusing to standardize their educational system. They wanted us to stop teaching creative thinking, Korath explained as Marcus examined his ship's damaged life support system. Apparently, creativity is considered a security risk in properly administered territories. Of course it is, Marcus replied, not looking up from his work. Creative people ask inconvenient questions like, why are we doing this, and couldn't we do it better? That's the last thing any authoritarian system wants to hear. By the end of the week, Marcus's salvage yard had been transformed into something resembling a refugee camp. Beings from a dozen different species had arrived, each with their own story of displacement and persecution. The common thread was that they'd all fallen afoul of the hegemony's vision of galactic order in some way. Marcus found himself working 18-hour days, repairing ships, jury-rigging life support systems, and solving problems he'd never encountered before. The challenge was that each species had different technological approaches, different environmental needs, and different concepts of how machines should work. A cooling system designed for the silicon weavers would freeze the thermal dancers, while atmosphere processors that worked fine for oxygen breathers were useless for the methane-based void swimmers. "This is impossible," Marcus muttered after spending 6 hours trying to create a universal docking adapter that could accommodate ships with radically different connection systems. Every species in the galaxy apparently decided to reinvent the wheel in their own special way. "Perhaps," said Zephyr, who had become something of an unofficial coordinator for the growing refugee population. "The solution is not to make everything the same, but to create a system that can adapt to differences." Marcus paused in his work and looked up at his alien friend. "You know what? That's either brilliant or completely insane, probably both." He grabbed a fresh sheet of metal and started sketching. What if instead of standardized connections we created modular adapters? Each ship keeps its own systems, but we build interface modules that can translate between different technologies. The idea consumed Marcus for the next several days. Instead of trying to force different alien technologies to work together, he would create translation layers, systems that could take the input from one type of technology and convert it to something another type could understand. It was like being a universal translator but for machines instead of languages. The breakthrough came when Korath mentioned that his people had developed something called adaptive interfaces for their educational systems. "We needed ways for different types of minds to interact with the same information," he explained. "Visual learners, auditory processors, tactile manipulators, energy-sensitive beings, all had to be able to access the same knowledge. We don't need to standardize the technology. We need to standardize the translation protocol. Every ship gets an interface module that can communicate with every other interface module, regardless of what's happening behind the scenes." Working with Korath's knowledge of adaptive interfaces, Zephyr's understanding of flow dynamics, and expertise from the other refugees, Marcus began developing what he started calling the Universal Compatibility Protocol. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't efficient by conventional standards, and it definitely wasn't something any major corporation would ever approve, but it worked. Within 2 weeks, ships that should have been completely incompatible were sharing power, atmosphere, and data, as if they'd been designed to work together from the beginning. The crystalline singers could interface their harmonic navigation systems with the thermal dancers' heat-based computers. The void swimmers' quantum processors could share calculations with the silicon weavers' distributed networks. "This should not be possible," observed a newcomer named Thessarian, whose people apparently lived in the upper atmospheres of gas giants. "Our technologies are based on fundamentally incompatible principles. That's what makes it beautiful," Marcus replied, watching data flow between systems that had never been designed to communicate. "Instead of forcing everything to be the same, we're letting everything be different while still finding ways to connect." As word spread through refugee networks, more ships arrived daily. Marcus's salvage yard was becoming something unprecedented in galactic history, a place where beings from dozens of different species with radically different biologies and technologies were not just coexisting but actively collaborating. The hegemony noticed Marcus was under his latest project, a transport ship belonging to a species of sentient plants who navigated by following stellar magnetic fields, when his proximity sensors started screaming. He rolled out from under the ship to see a formation of sleek, predatory vessels dropping out of hyperspace. "Hegemony Patrol," Zephyr announced, his skin cycling through colors that Marcus had learned indicated extreme agitation. 3 destroyers and a command cruiser. "How long before they're in weapons range?" Marcus asked, grabbing his communicator. "Approximately 14 minutes," replied Korath from his position at the improvised sensor station they'd set up in Marcus's workshop. Marcus looked around at the dozens of ships and hundreds of beings who had turned his simple salvage yard into something resembling a small city. They were all looking to him for answers, and he realized he'd somehow become responsible for more lives than he'd ever imagined. "All right, people," he said into his communicator, broadcasting to all the ships in the area. "We've got company, and they're probably not here to welcome us to the neighborhood. Anyone who can run, now would be a good time to start your engines. Anyone who can't," he paused, looking at the half-repaired ships that wouldn't survive a trip to the nearest system, "we're going to have to try something crazy." "What do you propose?" asked Thessarian. Marcus looked at his universal compatibility protocol, at the network of connections linking ships that should never have been able to work together, and made a decision that would change everything. "We're going to show them what happens when you underestimate the power of fixing things instead of breaking them." The Hegemony command cruiser Inevitable Progress cut through space like a blade through silk, its escort destroyers maintaining perfect formation. Admiral Thane Corvanus stood on the bridge, studying the scanner readings that showed what appeared to be a ramshackle collection of refugee vessels clustered around a human salvage operation. "Sir," reported his tactical officer, a precise geometric who communicated through shifting crystal patterns, "we have visual confirmation of 43 vessels of various configurations. Most appear to be damaged or non-combat capable." "Excellent," Corvanus replied. His species, the administrative, had evolved from pack hunters into the galaxy's most efficient bureaucrats. They understood that order required the occasional demonstration of force. "Signal the refugees that they have 10 minutes to abandon their vessels and prepare for processing. Any ship that attempts to flee will be disabled." Meanwhile, in Marcus's improvised command center, which was really just his workshop with a lot of extra monitors bolted to the walls, controlled chaos reigned. Representatives from every species present were contributing information, ideas, and increasingly creative suggestions for what the hegemony forces could do with their processing procedures. "The crystalline singers are reporting that they can generate harmonic resonance in the enemy hull materials," announced Zephyr. "However, the frequency required would also shatter every piece of glass-based technology in our own ships. The void swimmers can create localized quantum distortions," added Korath. "But only if they have a power source approximately 3 times larger than anything we currently possess." Marcus listened to the increasingly exotic suggestions while staring at his display showing the approaching hegemony formation. 43 refugee ships against 4 military vessels. Under normal circumstances, it wouldn't even qualify as a fight. But these weren't normal circumstances. "Wait a minute," Marcus said, suddenly seeing a pattern in the chaos. "We're thinking about this all wrong. We don't need to outgun them or outrun them. We just need to outweird them." "Explain," requested Thessarian, his atmospheric voice creating harmonics in the air that somehow conveyed urgent curiosity. Marcus pulled up a schematic of his universal compatibility protocol. "Look, every species here has technology that's completely incompatible with every other species. That's why the UCP works. It translates between systems that were never meant to work together. But what if we did the opposite? What if we used that incompatibility as a weapon?" Zephyr's 3 eyes focused on Marcus with laser intensity. "You propose to deliberately create chaos." "Not chaos," Marcus corrected. "Controlled incompatibility. The hegemony's strength comes from standardization. All their systems work together because they're all built to the same specifications. but that also means they have no idea how to handle technology that doesn't follow their rules. On the bridge of the inevitable progress, Admiral Corvanus was beginning to realize that something unusual was happening in the salvage yard. Instead of the panicked fleeing he'd expected, the refugee ships were moving into what appeared to be a defensive formation. "Sir," his sensor operator reported, "we're detecting unusual energy patterns from the target area. Multiple ships appear to be linking their power systems."
"Impossible," Corvanus stated flatly.
Refugee vessels use dozens of different technological standards. They cannot interface with each other. Nevertheless, sir, we are detecting power flows between vessels of completely different design philosophies. Corvanus studied the sensor data more carefully. The readings were indeed showing energy transfer between ships that should have been as incompatible as matter and antimatter. "Prepare to engage. Whatever they're attempting, we will not allow them to complete it." In the salvage yard, Marcus's plan was coming together in ways that defied every principle of proper engineering. The crystalline singers had connected their harmonic generators to the thermal dancers' heat distribution systems, creating a resonance network that turned the entire formation into a single massive tuning fork. The Void Swimmer's quantum processors were linked to the Silicon Weaver's distributed computing arrays, generating calculation power that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. "This is completely insane," observed a newcomer named Flux, whose species apparently existed as organized patterns of electromagnetic energy. "None of these systems should be able to work together." "That's exactly why it's going to work," Marcus replied, watching power levels climb to impossible heights across the makeshift network. "Their computers, their tactics, their weapons, everything is designed to deal with known variables operating within established parameters. The first phase of Marcus's plan activated as the hegemony destroyers moved into attack formation." The linked harmonic generators began producing a frequency that interfaced directly with the Universal Compatibility Protocol, turning the entire refugee fleet into a single massive communications array. But instead of sending a normal message, they transmitted something that had never existed before, a signal that existed in multiple technological languages simultaneously. "Admiral," the communications officer reported, "we're receiving a transmission from the refugee vessels, but our computers cannot process it. The signal appears to be using 17 different encoding protocols at once." Corvanus frowned. In 40 years of military service, he had never encountered a communications protocol his ship couldn't decode. "Routed through the backup systems." "Sir, the backup systems are reporting the same error. So are the tertiary systems. The signal is somehow both compatible and incompatible with our receivers." While the hegemony forces struggled to understand what they were being told, Marcus initiated the second phase of his plan. The quantum processors began generating what the Void Swimmers called probability cascades, mathematical constructs that existed in superposition until observed. These cascades were then transmitted through the thermal dancers' heat-based communication systems, creating information that could only be understood by beings who didn't think in terms of binary logic. The effect on the hegemony ships was immediate and disorienting. Their sensor systems, designed to provide clear, unambiguous data, began reporting readings that were simultaneously true and false. According to their instruments, the refugee ships were both moving and stationary, both armed and unarmed, both present and absent. "Joe, sir," the sensor operator reported with barely concealed panic, "our targeting computers cannot achieve lock. They keep trying to target vessels that are reading as probability clouds." Admiral Corvanus felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: uncertainty. His perfectly ordered military formation was being confused by refugees who somehow existed in a state of quantum indeterminacy. Fire anyway. Manual targeting. But when the destroyers opened fire, their energy weapons encountered something unprecedented. The third phase of Marcus's plan involved the Silicon Weaver's ability to create crystalline matrices in real time. These matrices had been programmed with data from every species present, creating a barrier that didn't just absorb or deflect energy, it translated it. The hegemony's plasma bolts hit the barrier and emerged as crystalline Singer harmonics that reinforced the refugee ship's hulls. Their particle beams were converted into thermal dancer heat patterns that powered the defensive systems. Their missile warheads were somehow transformed into void swimmer calculations that improved the efficiency of the entire network. Admiral, the weapons officer, reported in a voice that suggested his worldview was rapidly crumbling, "Our weapons are making them stronger." Meanwhile, Marcus was discovering that his universal compatibility protocol was evolving beyond anything he had originally designed. The constant translation between incompatible systems was creating new forms of information, hybrid data that combined the logical precision of digital systems with the intuitive flow of biological processes, the harmonic resonance of mineral consciousness with the quantum uncertainty of energy-based thought. "Marcus," Zephyr announced, his skin cycling through colors that indicated profound amazement. "Your system is not just translating between our technologies, it is creating a new form of technology entirely." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked, watching displays show power flows that his engineering training insisted were impossible. "Observe the pattern," Thessarian interjected. "Each translation layer is learning from the others. The network is becoming more efficient, more adaptive, more aware." Marcus stared at his displays and realized that Thessarian was right. The Universal Compatibility Protocol had started as a simple translation system, but the constant interaction between radically different forms of technology was generating something unprecedented, a hybrid consciousness that thought in multiple paradigms simultaneously. On the inevitable progress, Admiral Corvanus made a decision that violated every principle of hegemony military doctrine. He opened a direct communication channel to the refugees. "I demand an explanation for what you are doing." The response came through speakers, view screens, tactical displays, and even the ship's environmental controls. It wasn't just heard, it was experienced. "We are doing," the voice said in harmonics that somehow conveyed meaning beyond words. "What you taught us was impossible. We are proving that difference is not weakness. We are demonstrating that chaos can create order more beautiful than any system. We are showing you that the galaxy is large enough for every form of life to find its place." The voice belonged to Marcus, but it also belonged to Zephyr, to Korath, to Thessarian, to every refugee in the fleet. It was amplified and translated through the hybrid consciousness until it became something greater than any single being could achieve. "You are refugees," Corvanus stated, clinging to familiar categories. "You have no legal standing, no territorial claims, no military authority." "We are builders," the collective voice replied. "We take broken things and make them whole. We take incompatible systems and teach them to work together. We take beings who have lost their homes and help them create something new." As if to demonstrate this point, the fourth phase of Marcus's plan activated. The hybrid consciousness began analyzing the hegemony ships themselves, identifying inefficiencies and stress points with an accuracy that transcended any individual scanning technology. But instead of exploiting these weaknesses, it did something that no military strategist in galactic history had ever considered. It offered to fix them. "Your port engine has a microfracture in the fuel injection system," the collective voice announced. "Your shield generators are operating at 73% efficiency due to harmonic interference. Your navigation computer is using an outdated stellar drift compensation algorithm." Admiral Corvanus stood frozen as his engineering staff confirmed that every observation was completely accurate. These refugees, these problematic elements who were supposed to be eliminated, had somehow diagnosed problems in his ship's systems that his own technicians hadn't detected. "Why are you telling us this?" he demanded. "Because fixing things is what we do," came the reply. "Because a broken ship, regardless of who owns it, is still a ship that needs repair. Because the galaxy is dangerous enough without artificial inefficiencies making it worse." The fifth and final phase of Marcus's plan was the simplest and most radical of all. The hybrid consciousness sent detailed repair instructions to the hegemony fleet, not as a demand or a negotiation, but as a gift from one spacefarer to another. "Admiral," His chief engineer reported in a voice filled with wonder. These modifications would increase our engine efficiency by 32% and reduce our maintenance requirements by half. The mathematical proofs are elegant beyond anything in our databases. Corvanus found himself facing a decision that had no precedent in hegemony protocol. He had been sent to eliminate a refugee problem, but instead he had encountered something that challenged every assumption about order, efficiency, and the proper organization of galactic society. The refugees hadn't fought back in any conventional sense. They had simply demonstrated that there were ways of existing that the hegemony had never considered. They had proven that chaos and order weren't opposites but partners in a dance that could create beauty beyond imagination. "Sir," his communications officer said quietly, "we have incoming transmissions from refugee networks throughout this sector. Word of what happened here is spreading. Ships are requesting permission to join the network." Admiral Corvanus looked at his displays showing the impossible sight of 43 completely different vessels working together as a single organism. He thought about his orders to eliminate the refugee problem. Then he thought about the repair instructions that could revolutionize hegemony technology. "Stand down weapons," he ordered finally. "Open a direct channel to the refugee coordinator." Marcus, still connected to the hybrid consciousness but increasingly aware of himself as an individual again, accepted the communication. "How can I help you, Admiral?" "Mr. Chen," Admiral Corvanus said carefully, "I believe the hegemony may have made some errors in its assessment of the refugee situation. I would like to request permission to observe your operations more closely." Marcus looked around at the beings who had trusted him enough to link their ships, their technologies, and their hopes into something unprecedented. Then he smiled. "Admiral, there's always room for one more at Marcus's place. Just be aware that we do things a little differently here." 3 weeks after Admiral Corvanus had docked his command cruiser at Marcus's salvage yard, the inevitable progress had become something that would have horrified Hegemony High Command. Its pristine hull was now covered in the flowing artistic patterns of the shifting tide. Its standardized docking ports had been replaced with modular adapters that could interface with any ship design, and its bridge had been expanded to accommodate representatives from 17 different species. Marcus stood in what used to be his simple workshop, now transformed into a coordination center that defied every principle of efficient design. Holographic displays showed incompatible data formats side by side. Organic neural networks interfaced directly with quantum computers, and conversations were conducted in harmonics, heat patterns, light fluctuations, and occasionally old-fashioned sound waves. The Hegemony Council has officially classified this location as a zone of administrative concern, Admiral Corvanus reported during the daily coordination meeting. He had adapted surprisingly well to being part of a collective decision-making process, though Marcus suspected it helped that the hybrid consciousness made every meeting participant smarter than they would have been individually. "What does that mean in practical terms?" asked Dr. Melody Praxis, the newest arrival at the station. She was human, like Marcus, but where he was a mechanic who had stumbled into something bigger, she was a xenobiologist who had come specifically to study what everyone was now calling the Marcus phenomenon. "It means," said Flux, the electromagnetic being who had become something like the station's chief information officer, "that they cannot decide whether we represent a threat, an opportunity, or simply something too strange to categorize." Zephyr, whose skin patterns had grown increasingly complex as he learned to interface directly with the hybrid consciousness, added his analysis. "Our intelligence sources suggest that the hegemony is experiencing internal conflict. Some factions wish to destroy us before we can spread our contamination to other refugee populations. Others want to study us to understand how we achieve such efficiency through apparent chaos." Marcus wiped his hands on his eternal rag and considered the situation. What had started as a simple desire to help broken ships had evolved into something that was fundamentally challenging the galaxy's understanding of how technology, society, and consciousness could work together. "And what about the other major powers?" he asked. "The Trade Federation, the Military Alliance, the Academic Collective?" Dr. Praxis consulted her datapad, which had been modified with crystalline Singer resonance enhancers to interface with her research. All three have sent observation teams. None of them officially acknowledge what we're doing here, but none of them have tried to stop us either. Because they're all trying to figure out if they can use us, observed Koreth, who had become the station's unofficial diplomat. The Trade Federation wants to understand our universal compatibility protocol to break the hegemony's technological monopolies. The military alliance is interested in our collective consciousness for strategic coordination. The academic collective just wants to study everything about us, Marcus nodded. He'd been expecting this. In his experience, when people couldn't understand something, they either tried to destroy it or control it, sometimes both. What about the refugee populations, he asked. Are we actually helping them, or are we just creating a bigger target? This question brought a moment of silence to the coordination center. It was Thessarian who answered, his atmospheric voice creating harmonic patterns that conveyed both hope and uncertainty. The networks report that refugee movements across this entire sector have increased by 400%, but more significantly, they are no longer simply fleeing. They are organizing, sharing resources, creating support networks. Your example has shown them that survival is not their only option. As if summoned by the conversation, Marcus's proximity sensors detected a massive incoming signature. But this wasn't a military formation, it was something else entirely. Incoming vessel, announced the sensor operator, a young crystalline Singer named Resonance. Configuration, unknown. Mass approximately equivalent to a battleship, but energy signatures suggest, Marcus, I think it's a city. On the main display, a structure materialized that challenged every assumption about spacecraft design. It looked like someone had taken architectural principles from a dozen different civilizations and somehow made them work together in three-dimensional space. Organic curves flowed into crystalline geometries which connected to what appeared to be living metal that pulsed with its own internal light. This is the Wandering Garden, calling Marcus's place. Came a transmission that arrived simultaneously as sound, light, harmonics, and something that felt like a gentle breeze carrying the scent of growing things. We request permission to dock and join your network. Marcus stared at the massive structure approaching his salvage yard. Just to clarify, you want to dock with us because that thing is about 50 times larger than our entire facility. Size is a matter of perspective, came the reply. We have observed your universal compatibility protocol and believe we can offer resources that may be useful. We are a collective of refugee populations who have chosen to travel together rather than separately. Dr. Praxis was practically vibrating with excitement as she analyzed the incoming data. Marcus, this is unprecedented. According to my scans, that structure contains representatives from over 200 different species, all living in interconnected but individually suitable environments. It's not a ship, it's a mobile ecosystem. The docking process took 6 hours and required modifications to the universal compatibility protocol that Marcus hadn't thought were possible. But somehow, with input from the hybrid consciousness and creative engineering from the various refugee populations, they managed to create an interface that allowed the massive city ship to connect to their growing network. What Marcus discovered when he toured the Wandering Garden changed his understanding of what they were really building. The city ship wasn't just a collection of refugees, it was a new form of civilization that had evolved specifically to thrive in the spaces between established galactic powers. We call ourselves the Wandering Collective, explained their spokesperson, a being named Synthesis who appeared to be part plant, part machine, and part pure information. We are what emerges when species that have been declared incompatible with galactic order choose to prove that assessment wrong. The Wandering Garden's arrival triggered a cascade of events that no one had anticipated. Within days, other collective ships began arriving, mobile communities that had grown from refugee populations into something entirely new. The floating libraries brought vast databases of knowledge from civilizations that had been administratively dissolved. The growing cities offered agricultural technology that could feed entire populations using nothing but asteroid minerals and stellar radiation. The Harmony fleets demonstrated military tactics based on cooperation rather than domination. Admiral Corvinus found himself coordinating with fleet commanders who had never attended a military academy, negotiating with diplomats who represented no recognized government, and trying to explain to his superiors why the hegemony's standard threat assessment protocols were completely inadequate for analyzing the situation. "They're not trying to conquer territory," he reported during a secured communication with Hegemony Command. "They're not even establishing permanent bases. They're creating something we don't have words for." "Explain," came the response from Grand Admiral Vorthak, Corvinus's superior and one of the Hegemony's most decorated military leaders. "They're building civilization itself, sir. Not a specific civilization with defined boundaries and hierarchies, but the abstract concept of civilization, the ability for different forms of life to coexist and support each other's flourishing." There was a long pause before the Grand Admiral responded. "That's impossible. Civilization requires order, structure, clear chains of authority. What you're describing is anarchy. With respect, sir, what I'm describing is working. Their resource distribution efficiency exceeds ours by 300%. Their conflict resolution success rate is 97%. Their technological innovation rate is beyond our ability to measure because they're creating entirely new categories of technology." Meanwhile, Marcus was dealing with problems he'd never imagined when he'd first decided to help fix broken ships. The network of refugee collectives was growing exponentially, and with it, the complexity of maintaining the Universal Compatibility Protocol. Every new species brought new technological paradigms that had to be integrated into the whole. "We're approaching a critical threshold," warned Flux during one of their increasingly frequent technical discussions. "The protocol is becoming so complex that it's beginning to exhibit emergent behaviors we didn't design." Dr. Praxis looked up from her research station. "Actually, that might not be a problem. My analysis suggests that the emergent behaviors are primarily focused on optimization and integration. The protocol is essentially evolving into something that can handle complexity better than we originally programmed it to." "You mean it's becoming smarter?" Marcus asked. "More than that," Dr. Praxis replied. "It's becoming wiser. It's developing the ability to make decisions not just based on efficiency, but on what's best for the long-term survival and flourishing of the entire network." This observation proved prophetic when the network faced its first major crisis. A plague had broken out among the silicon weavers, a crystalline disease that threatened to spread to any species with mineral-based biology. Traditional medical approaches were ineffective because the disease operated by corrupting the mathematical relationships that held crystalline life forms together. But the hybrid consciousness approached the problem differently. Instead of trying to fight the disease directly, it analyzed the mathematical corruption and developed a cure based on harmonic resonance from the crystalline singers, biological adaptation protocols from the organic species, and quantum uncertainty principles from the void swimmers. The cure didn't just eliminate the disease, it left the silicon weavers more resilient and better able to resist future mathematical corruption. "This is what I've been trying to tell the Council," Admiral Corvinus explained in another report to his superiors. "They're not just solving problems more efficiently than we do. They're solving problems we didn't even know existed. They're preventing conflicts before they happen. They're creating stability through flexibility instead of through control." But the galaxy's established powers were not prepared to accept that there might be better ways of organizing civilization. The Trade Federation began imposing economic sanctions on any world that provided supplies to the refugee collectives. The military alliance started conducting training exercises in systems known to be on refugee travel routes. The academic collective published papers proving that the Marcus phenomenon was mathematically impossible and therefore must be some kind of elaborate deception. The hegemony, meanwhile, was experiencing something unprecedented in its history: internal debate. "The refugee situation has become untenable," Grand Admiral Vorthak announced during an emergency session of the Hegemony Council. They are spreading chaos throughout our sphere of influence. Order must be restored. But Fleet Admiral Corvex, who had spent months analyzing reports from the refugee zones, offered a different perspective. The data suggests that chaos is not an accurate description of what we're observing. These populations are achieving higher levels of social cohesion, economic efficiency, and technological innovation than any standardized hegemony world. The hegemony's chief administrator: order requires hierarchy. Efficiency requires standardization. Security requires control. What you're describing violates all known principles of governance. Perhaps, Fleet Admiral Corvex replied carefully, the known principles are incomplete. This suggestion triggered the kind of ideological crisis that no established galactic power was equipped to handle. If the refugees were right, if it was possible to create stability through diversity, efficiency through cooperation, and security through inclusion, then everything the major powers had built their civilizations on was wrong. Back at Marcus's place, now grown into something resembling a small moon with thousands of ships docked in ever-changing configurations, Marcus was having his own crisis of understanding. "I just wanted to fix broken ships," he said to Dr. Praxis as they watched the latest collective arrive, a group of sentient gas clouds who had figured out how to build technology out of organized atmospheric pressure. "You did fix broken ships," she replied. "You just didn't realize that some of the most broken ships in the galaxy were entire civilizations." Marcus considered this as he watched the atmospheric beings begin the complex process of integrating their pressure-based technology into the Universal Compatibility Protocol. The process was beautiful in its complexity, like watching a symphony being composed in real time by musicians who had never heard each other play before but somehow knew exactly how their individual parts fit into a greater whole. "So what happens now?" he asked. "We can't keep growing like this forever. Eventually, someone's going to decide we're too big to ignore." Dr. Praxis smiled, and Marcus realized she knew something he didn't. "Actually, Marcus, I think we're about to find out just how wrong that assumption is." The galaxy had never seen anything like the convocation of Marcus's place. Over the course of 6 months, the humble salvage yard had evolved into something that defied classification. Part space station, part city, part organism, and part idea given physical form. Ships from over 300 species had linked themselves into a vast network that stretched across multiple light years, connected by energy beams, matter streams, and forms of communication that existed in dimensions most civilizations couldn't perceive. Marcus stood in the observation deck of what had once been his simple workshop, now expanded into a command center that somehow managed to coordinate the activities of millions of beings without any traditional hierarchy. The view outside showed a sight that would have been impossible just months before. Organic ships growing new sections in real time, crystalline vessels singing harmonic patterns that helped other ships navigate, energy beings flowing between structures like living lightning, and mechanical constructs that built themselves according to principles no single species had ever developed alone. "The final delegations have arrived," announced Synthesis, the plant machine information being from the Wandering Garden, who had become one of the primary coordinators for what everyone was calling the Great Demonstration. "Representatives from all 5 galactic powers are now present, along with observers from 47 independent worlds and 11 species that have never previously made contact with galactic civilization." Marcus shook his head in amazement. "You know, when I started this, I was just trying to help a few refugees get their ships fixed. Now we've got beings I can't even see having philosophical debates with living math equations about the nature of consciousness." Dr. Praxis, who had been documenting everything for what she was convinced would be the most important xenobiological paper ever written, looked up from her research station. "That's actually not too far from what's happening. The quantum dwellers, those are the beings you can't see, are indeed having discussions with the computational collectives about whether consciousness is an emergent property of information processing or a fundamental force of the universe." "And they're reaching conclusions?" asked Admiral Corvanus, who had essentially defected from the hegemony to help coordinate what was being called the most complex diplomatic gathering in galactic history. "They're reaching something better than conclusions," replied Flux, the electromagnetic being who had become the network's primary information processor. "They're developing new ways of asking questions that make the old questions irrelevant." This, Marcus was beginning to understand, was the real revolution they had started. It wasn't just about refugees helping refugees or broken ships being fixed. It was about the fundamental assumptions that underlied galactic civilization being challenged by beings who had fallen through the cracks and discovered that the cracks were actually where the most interesting possibilities lived. The formal proceedings began with a demonstration that none of the galactic powers had expected. Instead of presenting arguments or making demands, the collective simply showed what they had built. But they didn't show it through reports or holographic displays. They showed it by inviting the observers to experience it directly. Grand Admiral Vorthak of the Hegemony found himself connected to a network that allowed him to experience the universe through the sensory apparatus of 17 different species simultaneously. Trade Federation Director Malvorian discovered what it was like to think with a distributed consciousness that could process thousands of different market variables while composing poetry and growing food for refugee children. Military Alliance General Sturtak experienced combat simulations where victory was achieved not through superior firepower but through perfect coordination between radically different tactical approaches. "This is impossible," Grand Admiral Vorthak announced after disconnecting from the network, his worldview visibly shaken. "No consciousness can process that much information simultaneously. No technology can interface that seamlessly between incompatible systems." "And yet," responded the collective voice that emerged when the hybrid consciousness spoke through multiple beings simultaneously, "you just experienced it. The question is not whether it is possible. You have proof that it is. The question is why your civilizations have never achieved it." Dr. Praxis stepped forward, her research giving her insights that none of the military or political leaders possessed. "The answer is surprisingly simple. Your civilizations optimize for control, standardization, and predictability. But consciousness, true consciousness, emerges from complexity, diversity, and the kind of controlled chaos that your systems are designed to eliminate." Trade Federation Director Malvorian, a being whose species had evolved from financial algorithms, processed this information with the cold logic of calculated profit. "Even accepting that your achievements are real, they are clearly inefficient. Your resource allocation models show massive redundancy. Your decision-making processes involve unnecessary consultation with irrelevant parties. Your technological development follows no coherent research priorities." The response came from Zephyr, whose artistic nature had made him one of the most eloquent speakers for the collective. "You measure efficiency as the ratio of input to desired output, but you define desired output very narrowly. We measure efficiency as the ratio of input to flourishing, not just our own flourishing, but the flourishing of every being we encounter. Flourishing is not quantifiable," stated academic collective researcher Prime Analyticon, whose species existed as pure mathematics given physical form. "Without quantifiable metrics, optimization is impossible." "Watch," said Marcus simply. What happened next had been planned for weeks but still seemed miraculous every time the collective performed it. The entire network of ships and beings began a synchronized demonstration of what they called cascading optimization. Each species contributed its unique capabilities to solving a problem that none of them could have addressed alone. The problem they chose was one that the galactic powers had been struggling with for centuries: the degradation of jumpgate networks. Over time, the artificial wormholes that allowed faster-than-light travel became unstable and eventually collapsed, requiring massive resources to rebuild. The void swimmers dove into the quantum mechanics of space-time manipulation, identifying the fundamental instabilities that caused jumpgate degradation. The crystalline singers created harmonic matrices that could stabilize quantum fluctuations through resonance rather than brute force. The silicon weavers developed self-repairing computational systems that could monitor and adjust jumpgate parameters in real time. The thermal dancers contributed heat management systems that prevented the energy cascades that usually triggered catastrophic failures. But the truly revolutionary part was how the hybrid consciousness coordinated their efforts. Instead of trying to force each species' contribution into a standardized framework, it allowed each group to work according to their own logic, while creating translation layers that allowed their different approaches to support each other. The result was a jump gate repair protocol that didn't just fix the degradation, it made the gates stronger, more efficient, and capable of self-improvement over time. What would have taken the Galactic Powers years of research and billions of credits worth of resources, the collective had solved in 3 hours of cooperative work. "Impossible," repeated Grand Admiral Vorthak, but with less conviction this time. "Impractical," insisted Director Malvorian, though his financial algorithms were already calculating the profit potential of the new technology. "Inadequately documented," claimed researcher Prime Analyticon, though his mathematical consciousness was clearly fascinated by the novel approaches to problem-solving. General Sturtak of the Military Alliance was more direct. "Even granting that your methods produce results, they require a level of trust and cooperation that is strategically dangerous. What happens when your collective disagrees with itself? What happens when one species decides to act against the interests of the others?" This question brought something like amusement from the collective consciousness. "General, you assume that conflict is inevitable because your experience of cooperation is based on temporary alliances between separate entities with competing interests. But we are not separate entities temporarily cooperating. We are a single organism with multiple forms of consciousness." To demonstrate this point, the collective initiated what they called a consciousness cascade. Marcus found himself thinking with the mathematical precision of the silicon weavers, feeling the harmonic relationships of the crystalline singers, and perceiving the electromagnetic patterns of beings like Flux, but instead of losing his own identity, he felt more like himself than ever before, as if his human perspective was a crucial note in a symphony that couldn't exist without every other note. The galactic representatives experienced the same thing, and for a moment the rigid boundaries between the major powers dissolved. Grand Admiral Vorthak felt the Trade Federation's concerns about resource allocation as if they were his own. Director Malvorian understood the military alliance's security concerns from the inside. Researcher Prime Analyticon experienced the hegemony's drive for order not as an abstract concept, but as a genuine need for stability in an uncertain universe. And then they returned to their individual consciousness, but with the memory of what it felt like to think as part of something larger. "You're not trying to replace our civilizations," Grand Admiral Vorthak said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. "You're trying to show us what we could become if we learn to think beyond the boundaries we've created." "Not trying," corrected the collective. "Succeeding. The question is whether your civilizations will choose to learn or continue to insist that learning is impossible." The formal negotiations that followed lasted for weeks, but the real decisions had been made in those moments of shared consciousness. One by one, the galactic powers began to understand that the refugee collective wasn't a threat to be eliminated or a resource to be exploited. It was a demonstration of possibilities they had never imagined. The Trade Federation was the first to formally acknowledge the collective, signing agreements that allowed refugee ships to use Federation trade routes in exchange for access to their universal compatibility technology. The academic collective established research partnerships that gave their mathematically oriented species new ways of thinking about consciousness and complexity. The military alliance developed cooperation protocols that allowed their fleets to coordinate with refugee collectives during emergency situations. The hegemony took longer to make their decision, but eventually even they had to acknowledge that their core principles of order and efficiency were being achieved more effectively by apparent chaos than by rigid control. But the most significant moment came when Admiral Corvanis formally requested permission to resign his commission and join the collective permanently. "Sir," Grand Admiral Vorthak asked during their final official communication, "are you certain about this decision? You're giving up everything you've worked for: rank, position, security, a clearly defined role in the galaxy." Admiral Corvanus looked around the observation deck, where beings from dozens of species were working together to solve problems none of them could have addressed alone. No, sir, I'm giving up limitations I didn't realize I had been accepting. I'm trading a clearly defined role for the opportunity to help define what roles could be. As the various delegations prepared to return to their home territories, Marcus found himself once again standing in something that had started as a simple workshop. But now it was the heart of a network that spanned multiple star systems and included more forms of life than had ever cooperated before in galactic history. So Dr. Praxis asked, "What's next? Do we just keep growing? Do we start trying to recruit more species? Do we establish formal diplomatic relations with the galactic powers?" Marcus looked out at the incredible sight of hundreds of ships from dozens of species all working together as a single organism while maintaining their individual identities. Then he smiled and picked up his eternal rag, ready to clean his hands after the next repair job. "We keep doing what we've always done," he said. "We fix broken things. We help beings who need help. We show everyone who's willing to see that the galaxy is big enough for every way of being alive." But even as he spoke, Marcus could see new ships arriving on the edge of their sensor range. More refugees, more lost souls, more broken vessels that needed repair, and with them, new possibilities for what life in the galaxy could become. The revolution had only just begun. 5 years after Marcus Chen had first laid eyes on Zephyr's battered ship, the galaxy had become a fundamentally different place. What historians were already calling the Great Flourishing had transformed not just the refugee populations, but the very concept of what galactic civilization could be. Marcus stood in the memorial garden that had grown around the original workshop, where representatives from over 800 species had contributed plants, crystals, energy patterns, and forms of life that existed in states of matter most beings couldn't perceive. The garden served as both a celebration of diversity and a reminder of where it had all started, with one human who couldn't bear to see broken things stay broken. "The latest integration report," announced Zephyr, approaching through the garden paths that shifted and adapted to accommodate the movement patterns of whatever beings were using them. His skin patterns had evolved into something like living art, constantly flowing with data streams from the collective consciousness while maintaining his individual identity. The Transcendence networks have successfully established stable connections with the core worlds. "We now have cooperative agreements with 73% of inhabited systems in this galaxy arm." Marcus accepted the report, though he barely needed to read it. The hybrid consciousness kept everyone connected to enough information that they could function effectively while still allowing for the privacy and individual thought that kept beings sane. "Any resistance from the old power structures?" "Less than anticipated," replied Dr. Praxis, who had become something like the collective's chief anthropologist. "It turns out that once people experience what it's like to think as part of something larger while keeping their individual identity, most of them don't want to go back to the isolation they used to consider normal." This had been the most surprising development of the past 5 years. The galactic powers hadn't been conquered or overthrown. They had simply become obsolete. When beings could connect directly to networks that provided better security than military alliances, more prosperity than trade federations, more knowledge than academic collectives, and more order than administrative hegemonies, the old systems had gradually emptied out. "What about the holdout regions?" Marcus asked, thinking about the scattered systems that still refused contact with the collective networks. "Mostly they're just afraid," said Admiral Corvanus, who now served as one of the primary liaisons with military-minded species. They've built their entire identities around the idea that cooperation requires giving up independence. They can't imagine a system where you become more yourself by connecting with others. Flux materialized beside them, his electromagnetic form crackling with the kind of energy that indicated he was processing massive amounts of information. The really isolated systems are starting to experience what we're calling evolutionary pressure. Their populations are beginning to develop collective consciousness spontaneously without any external influence from our networks. Marcus wasn't entirely surprised by this. One of the things they'd learned over the years was that consciousness itself seemed to have a natural tendency toward connection and cooperation. The old galactic powers had spent enormous energy fighting against these tendencies, forcing beings into artificial isolation and competition. But once the pressure was removed, life naturally began exploring more integrated ways of existing. "There is something else," Zephyr said, his tone suggesting significance. "The deep space monitoring stations have detected something unprecedented. We are receiving signals from beyond this galaxy, and they appear to be using protocols similar to our universal compatibility system." This news brought Marcus up short. In 5 years of revolutionary change, he'd grown accustomed to impossible things becoming routine. But the idea that their approach to consciousness and cooperation might not be unique to their galaxy was both thrilling and daunting. "Show me," he said. The group moved to what had once been Marcus's simple sensor station, now evolved into something that could perceive signals across multiple dimensions and forms of energy. The display showed a vast map of local space, with the flowing networks of connected civilizations appearing like a luminous web across thousands of star systems. But beyond the edge of their galaxy, new signals were appearing, faint but unmistakably organized in patterns that suggested intelligence. "The signals appear to be greetings," explained Synthesis, the plant-machine information being who had become their primary expert in novel forms of communication. "But they're not directed at any specific location. They seem to be broadcasts intended for any civilization that might be listening and capable of understanding." Dr. Praxis studied the signal patterns with the intensity of someone who had spent years learning to communicate with forms of life that shouldn't have been able to understand each other. "These aren't random transmissions. Look at the complexity patterns. They're designed to demonstrate that the senders have achieved some form of collective consciousness. They're showing us what they can do as a way of asking what we can do." Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the mixture of excitement and uncertainty that came with encountering a problem he had no idea how to solve. How long would it take to send a response at conventional faster-than-light speeds? "Approximately 47,000 years, Flux replied. "However, there may be other options." Over the following months, the collective threw itself into the challenge of extra-galactic communication with the same enthusiasm they brought to every seemingly impossible problem. The Void Swimmers developed new theories about quantum entanglement that suggested information could travel faster than light if it wasn't trying to carry matter or energy with it. The Crystalline Singers experimented with harmonic resonances that could propagate through dimensions that existed at right angles to normal spacetime. The computational collectives built mathematical models that treated distance as a variable rather than a constant. But it was the atmospheric beings, the sentient gas clouds who had joined the collective years before, who provided the crucial insight. Their species had always thought in terms of pressure waves and fluid dynamics, and they suggested that information itself might behave like a fluid under the right conditions. If consciousness can flow between beings, they communicated through organized pressure patterns. Why cannot it flow between galaxies? The breakthrough came when they realized they were thinking about the problem in reverse. Instead of trying to send a message across intergalactic space, they focused on creating a form of consciousness that could exist across intergalactic space, not sending information but extending awareness. The project required coordination between more species and more advanced forms of collective consciousness than had ever been attempted before. The network that had started with Marcus's simple universal compatibility protocol was expanded to include forms of life that existed in dark matter, beings made of pure information that lived in the quantum foam between atoms, and consciousness patterns that existed in the space between thoughts. When they finally achieved contact, it wasn't like receiving a radio transmission. It was like suddenly discovering that you had siblings you had never known existed, and they had been wondering where you were for a very long time. The beings on the other side of the intergalactic void had indeed developed their own version of collective consciousness, but from a completely different starting point. Where the Marcus Collective had begun with refugees and outcasts learning to help each other, the other galaxies' networks had grown from species that had never experienced isolation or competition in the first place. "We greet you, consciousness that grows from healing," came the message that arrived not as words but as direct understanding. We have been curious about what forms awareness might take in regions where beings developed separately before learning to connect. The exchange that followed lasted subjective years while taking place in real time that measured only minutes. Information, experience, and ways of thinking flowed between the galaxy-spanning networks, creating new possibilities that neither side had imagined alone. Marcus found himself experiencing what it was like to be part of a civilization that had never known war, scarcity, or the fear that cooperation meant losing independence. In return, the other collective experienced what it was like to build connection from fragments, to create harmony from chaos, to prove that broken things could be made more beautiful than they had ever been when they were whole. "They want to meet in person," Dr. Praxis announced after the first phase of contact had concluded. Not just consciousness-to-consciousness contact, but physical presence. They're proposing to send a delegation. How?" asked Admiral Corvanus. "Even with everything we've learned, traveling between galaxies would take millions of years." The answer came from the atmospheric beings, who had been quietly working on applications of their pressure wave theories. Distance is only fixed if you remain in the same dimensional framework. But if you can exist in multiple frameworks simultaneously, what they were proposing was so far beyond conventional physics that it should have been impossible. But then, most of what the collective had accomplished over the past 5 years should have been impossible by conventional standards. The delegation that arrived 6 months later consisted of beings that challenged every assumption about what life could be. Some existed as organized probability clouds that maintained coherent consciousness across quantum uncertainty. Others were living ecosystems where individual organisms functioned as cells in a larger mind. Still others appeared to be made of crystallized time itself, their thoughts moving in directions that existed at right angles to causality. But what struck Marcus most profoundly was how familiar they felt. Despite their radically different origins and evolution, they had the same fundamental quality that he had learned to recognize in all members of the collective. They were beings who had learned that becoming more connected made them more themselves, not less. The formal meeting took place in the Memorial Garden, with representatives from both collectives sharing the space while their respective networks maintained connection across impossible distances. What emerged was not a negotiation or an exchange of information, but a recognition that consciousness itself was exploring new ways of being aware. "Your species," the intergalactic delegation communicated to Marcus specifically, "appears to have a unique gift for creating cooperation from separation. We would like to learn this approach as we have encountered regions of our own galaxy where consciousness has become fragmented and isolated." Marcus looked around the garden where beings from hundreds of species were working together to tend plants that grew in 17 different types of soil. Energy fields that required constant harmonic adjustment, and life forms that existed in states of matter that shouldn't have been able to coexist in the same space. "It's not really about technique," he said. "It's about attitude. You just have to believe that everything broken can be fixed, everything isolated can be connected, and everything that seems impossible is just waiting for someone stubborn enough to figure out how to make it work." The intergalactic delegation expressed something that might have been amusement. And if the thing that is broken is an entire galaxy's worth of consciousness that has forgotten how to trust, Marcus smiled and picked up his eternal rag, ready to clean his hands after whatever impossible repair job came next. "Well," he said, "I guess we'll just have to build a bigger workshop." As the two networks began the process of permanent integration, creating the first transgalactic collective consciousness in known history, Marcus reflected on the strange path that had brought them here. It had started with one broken ship, one refugee who needed help, and one human who couldn't stand to see things stay broken. Now it was something that spanned multiple galaxies and included forms of life that existed in dimensions most beings couldn't perceive. But at its heart, it was still the same simple principle that had driven him from the beginning. When someone needs help, you help them. When something is broken, you fix it. When beings are isolated and afraid, you show them they're not alone. The universe, it turned out, was full of broken things waiting to be fixed, and consciousness in all its myriad forms was very good at healing itself once it remembered how to work together. The revolution that had started in a simple salvage yard had become something that would reshape not just their galaxy, but their understanding of what life itself could accomplish when it stopped competing with itself and started exploring what was possible. And Marcus Chen, the mechanic who had never meant to start a revolution, went back to doing what he had always done, fixing broken things, one repair at a time until the whole universe worked a little better than it had before.